Okay, colleagues, so I think we're going to start now, and so let's get going. So what the workshop is then all about is, as you can see on the theme, it's about research ethics. So that's the focus. Obviously, ethics is a very wide field, and we are not going to look at things like professional ethics or anything like that. I mean, those are separate parts that we can spend a whole day or two on its own. But we're going to focus on research ethics, the ethics around the way that we do research, that we should take in consideration when we are involved ourselves as researchers or when we supervise students. I think that's also important, because remember, these training sessions are for supervisors and for ethics committee members. And so it goes both ways, because we as supervisors and as ethics committee members have a big responsibility to make sure that we know the ethical principles that are at play, but that we can also teach others about it. Because ethics education is what we do, but it actually becomes everyone's responsibility where we are. That we take it back to our faculties, to our environments, that we take it back to our students, take it back to our colleagues, and that we do it ourselves. Because ultimately we are going to be held responsible for the way that we conduct our own research. Good morning. And so that is what the focus is going to be. You will see we're going to then work with bioethics principles. And so as we go along, I will sort of we will sort of start to unpack all of this and look at some of the principles, some of the more important principles in this, in today, and then in what we're going to do tomorrow. Okay, so when we look at it, I think we can start with a game. Just when you think you're all comfortable, I need to sort of shake you up again. Okay, so the game is going to work like this. Okay, let's say we're 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. Okay, I will participate. So we're going to have 2 circles of 6 persons each. Okay, the first circle is going to stand here like I do, like this. And the second circle is going to stand on the outside like this. Okay, so we're going to stand in 6 pairs. That's what it comes down to. Okay, so let's quickly do that. Yeah, please. Okay, somebody must be in the middle looking out, and some must be standing on the outside looking in. Okay, 2 little circles. So let's see. Okay, so just stand in front of somebody else. Let's just see. Okay, if there's not enough on the inside, we need to be 6 on the inside. Okay, so Cynthia, join the inside group. And
another one, yeah.
Okay, let's see. Okay, and I will stand here. Okay, so you can just stand like this. You can stand in front of her. Let's just see. Oh, let me just see. Oh, we're enough. Let's just get the numbers right here. Okay, so you 2 together, you 2 together. The 2 of you can be together. You can stand like this, and like this, and like this. Yes. Okay, now, I'm going to give you a question. And you have just 1 minute to discuss the question with the person in front of you. Okay. The question is this. What do you think is the biggest moral problem or biggest moral challenge in South Africa today? What do you think is the biggest moral problem or moral challenge in South Africa today? Okay, 1 minute, go. What do you think?
I think the challenge would be the matter of
the leadership in the country.
Yes.
Whereby now there is lack of people that really can be able to lead in, not necessarily in government, but maybe in different sectors,
yes,
such as maybe education, business, communities,
yes,
religious organizations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's in a sense, I always feel there's lots of reactive leaders and not proactive leaders. I think that for me that is one of the bigger problems, that lots of leaders just stand back and let things happen and react to it rather than make things happen and really lead and stand in front.
So somebody can think about, you said something like reactive, and somebody can think about being proactive as well,
Yes.
you know, to minimize risk, to minimize maybe threats.
Yes.
Because as a leader, there might be threats that are involved.
Exactly, yes.
That can harm lives of the people.
Yes.
That can affect psychology of the people.
Yes.
Yeah. That can also affect the economy in general.
Yes.
You know, So those are the things that actually exist. Maybe given South African perspective.
Yes. Okay.
Say so,
Okay, excellent. Okay, 1 minute is done. Now, the outside group must move one person to your left. And then you will have another minute to discuss, to keep on discussing the whole issue with the next person. So, the outside group, move to your left. Yes?
Hello.
Yes? Okay, 1 more minute. Hi, Jessica. Okay, I think that we've discussed that leadership is perhaps one of the most important challenges. And there's often a lack of good leadership, leaders that can properly look at the risks and look forward. But I also feel for myself, to link on to this, is there's also for me sometimes lack of integrity in persons that doesn't just do the right thing because it's the right thing. They try to get away with as much as they can. It's just that internal integrity that I feel is a big problem.
What the lady said that was here is seeing the outside and not looking deeper into the person, judging them on their clothes, the car they drive, those kind of things. But I agree in terms of the integrity, that whole thing of the small things that they don't. There must always be someone that look after them, then they will do the right things. But it doesn't come from inside. And you can see it everywhere where people drive on in the yellow line. Jaywalking across the street, and we all do it, and you don't think that these small things add up to the bigger things.
It becomes the norm actually later on. Nobody questions it any longer. It's just, okay, everyone does it, so why bother? Okay.
And it's really something that, how do you live with it? It's the only thing that you can do is, I'm not going to do that. But and it's really something in my head that I must get right, because I get very angry when people do that. And then I must say to myself, but you don't do it. You're not responsible for that person. You don't let that person ruin your whole day with that.
Okay, 1 minute's done. The outside group is going to move to your left once more. You have only 30 more seconds. That's the last round to wrap it up and decide, together with the person in front of you, the one biggest challenge for morality in South Africa today. Okay, move to your left. 30 seconds. Hi, I didn't get your name. Uwe, pleased to meet you.
We thought it wasn't too long.
Oh, sure.
We thought it took long, and then everyone went in the venue.
Yeah, sure. There's nobody
Wrong
here.
venue.
Okay, no, welcome.
We thought the problem was self-centered, people thinking of themselves, being selfish, only thinking of themselves and not others. You think about corruption, you think about the economy, you think about the state of the country, it's politics, it's all a group of people or a person that only think about themselves. And if you maybe sacrifice some of your own stuff, others will also benefit. So I think that's what we thought the biggest moral problem is.
I think the previous two persons, the one person said leadership and the other person said integrity. And linking up to this is that inborn or inherent characteristics of persons that is sort of just on a downward slope, in general at least, that creates big problems.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, 30 seconds done.
Paul wants to talk.
Okay, you can just go back to your desk, please. Okay, so obviously the aim of a game is not just to have fun, in training at least. There must be some deeper meaning or some deeper level that the game function on. So what do you think do I want you to get from this game? If you must now stand a little bit back and look at it from an education perspective, what on earth do you think do I want you to get from this game?
Maybe different points of views of people.
Yes, yes. That we can ask one little question, but we can hear so many different views. Sometimes opposing views, sometimes just a different view. Yes, so there's definitely one part. What else?
Listening skills.
Listening skills, yes. Think of it, when you have just 1 minute, you can either yourself talk the whole minute, or you must sort of be in control of yourself and talk a little bit and then sort of allow the other person to talk and to listen. Can you see, I think that's really important. When we are busy with ethics in general, we must remember there are different viewpoints, but we must be open to listen. Sometimes everyone can stand in their own little corner and just fight for their own perspective. And that's where lots of fighting in society comes from nowadays, where hardly anyone wants to properly listen and they just want to defend their own perspective.
Again, for me, tapping into all that, what they have said, it's understanding that there's multiple realities.
Yes.
And
yes.
As a result, you need to, as a group, or if you're conversing with a person, to find common ground.
Yes.
In terms of having an understanding.
Yes.
Like you're saying, different perspectives,
yeah.
different perceptions,
yeah.
different realities.
Yes.
But
yeah.
for the sake of commonality, the
yeah.
question was in South Africa.
Yes. Yes.
What do we find in South
yes.
Africa, the context
yes.
of South Africa? So in South Africa,
yeah.
what is it that we
yeah.
view? And henceforth, different realities
yeah.
that are informed by
yeah.
different perceptions.
Yeah, and we each stand and look at it from our own little perspective. Nobody stands on the high ground here. Everyone stands at some or other place with some experiences, good or bad, and they find some things more important than others. Perhaps the last thing that you can learn from this game, what would that be? I think one other thing that we can perhaps experience is that, did you realize that when you moved to the next person, you took some of your previous ideas to that discussion and to the next discussion? And I mean, that's how we work in science in general, but also in ethics. That you actually just in a few minutes learn something from another person, and that influences the next discussion. It might actually change your viewpoint a little bit. You say, now that you mentioned that, I actually think I agree with that more, or I like that idea more, or you say it in a different way. And so that is how we function in ethics, and that's how we're going to go forward in our discussion. So let's look a little bit, move a little bit towards where we want to go. What is ethics in general? I mean, this is a question that can keep us busy pretty much for the rest of the day if we ask that one. But if we just break it down to what we do, we can actually say this in this one short definition. Anne Robertson is a colleague of mine in the University of Toronto in Canada, and she summarizes it to say, research is finding out the things that we don't know. Think about it. Actually, that's what research is all about. The stuff that we know, we're not going to do projects on. It's the stuff that we don't fully understand, we want to elaborate on, or completely new things. That is what research is all about, finding out the things that we don't know. And ethics is how we do it. So it's not what we do, it's how we do it. The what we do is the research, the process, the methodology, the questions, the experiments, the interviews. That's the what. The ethics is asking, okay, how do we do all of this? So immediately you can hear ethics want to say, okay, there can be ways that are perhaps not that good, that we can do something, but it's perhaps not the best way, or perhaps not even allowed to do it in this way. And so that's where ethics come from. So we can always remember that. Ethics is creating a context, the way that we conduct our research, the way that we publish our research, the way that we go to conferences, that we spend money, that we treat participants. And although we're not going to look at things like animals today, but even in those projects, the way that we treat animals. We can collect data in exactly the same way. In one experiment, animals can experience excruciating pain. In another one, we can sedate them, for instance, can you see? And then we would say the second one was the better project. Same data, same research, but a different way of doing it, can you see? And so that is what we are going to look at in this. But then sometimes we see this, that researchers often and supervisors often experience, okay, all this ethics stuff is just putting up a whole lot of roadblocks. You can't go left, you can't go right, you can't go forward. So sometimes you feel a little bit despair. You say, okay, but so can I do anything here? Because I think sometimes we get to that. And obviously that is not the case, but this is the experience that we often have of ethics, that ethics is just trying to block everything. The interesting part is, and you can ask Cynthia, it's on the Central Committee, that the committee consists of persons that are actually passionate about research themselves. They do lots of projects themselves. So clearly, ethics is not about blocking research, can you see? It's in a sense to make sure that the research we do is accountable research, is credible research, that it can stand up and we're not ashamed of what we do. We can just look back in history of experiments, and I'm going to show you some a bit later on, that were done, that if we look back now, we just say, how on earth could somebody think that is going to be acceptable research? I mean, they did wonderful projects, but in real terrible ways. We can think of what happened in World War II with the Nazi doctors. They were actually busy with research, and somehow that research became very notorious to such an extent that much of what we do in ethics today not started there, but is based on all those atrocities. And that was research. Back then they were thinking, this is acceptable stuff, can you see? And so that is what we are going to work with. So the aim of research is actually well said in this quote from Professor Doug Wassenaar. He is the chairperson of the Human Sciences Research Council Ethics Committee, but he's also a well-renowned researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And so somewhere he wrote this little quote on, okay, so why do we want to do or focus on research ethics? And he said, the aim of research ethics is to ensure that participants are treated with dignity and respect. So there's one important part, is to ensure that participants are treated with dignity and respect. Now those two words you can immediately think, okay, so what is dignity and what is respect? Because clearly there might be lots of ideas around that. So we're going to look at that. How do we treat participants with dignity and respect? But then you will see the definition or the little quote goes further. Because it's not just about, okay, let's treat everyone with dignity and respect. There's a very good reason for it. Because remember, in research, participants contribute to the social good and to research endeavors. Think of it. Why do we all do research ultimately? Hopefully not to get a degree. I mean, that's part of it. Not to write a paper, not to go to an international conference, because that would be rather dicey motivation to be involved in research. All of that is part of research, clearly. But why do we do research? Because we want to build a better society, ultimately. Doesn't matter what we do, whether we're busy with ICT, whether we're busy with the arts, whether we're busy with medical sciences, whether we're busy with curriculum development. Ultimately, we all aim to better society, the context in which we live in. And obviously, that context can be small as the university, can be big like the world. Just depends on our research topic. But that is the bottom motivation. That's why we are all involved in research. We could have done anything else. I mean, we could have been engineers in industry, we could have been software developers, but we chose to be in an environment where we do research. And so that becomes the reason, can you see? So when we speak about research ethics, is because we realize that the participants in our projects help us to contribute to society. Without those participants, we're not going to do much research, think of it. If I can't send out questionnaires, if I can't conduct interviews, if I can't do focus groups or do experiments on individuals, I won't have data. I won't be able to develop new models, etc., etc. You see. And so ultimately in all we do in these 2 days, we must keep this in mind, because that's the motivation. We don't do ethics just because there's something else nice to do now that we call ethics. That would be a real shame. We are involved in thinking about ethics because it's a central concept in research and how we view our place in society as researchers, as academics. And so that is what we're going to do in these 2 days. So let's move a little bit forward and say something about this word ethics. Ethics is more than compliance to rules, regulations, codes of conduct, or to checklists. This is an important thing to remember. Ethics is more than this. Often when we work, we find that students and sometimes supervisors just say, okay, give me the checklist. Now, I've got the right documents, I've done this, and they think their project is suddenly ethical. But can you see, I think you would have realized by now, ethics is not that. It's part of it, yes. But ethics is not about, okay, what's the rule? Okay, so let's just comply to the rule. Because compliance, in a sense, is low-level ethics. Because if it's, let me give you an example. Last year, I heard about a case where a researcher, staff member, was found to have plagiarized some material. Okay, clearly, it was quite evident. When this person was confronted, guess what was his response? He said, the university doesn't have a policy on plagiarism, so I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, can you see? Compliance to rules. If there's no rule, then that's fine. Can you see? He's just said there was no policy on plagiarism, so I didn't do anything wrong. You can't show me the rule that I've transgressed, so I'm fine. Can you see? You actually feel a little bit sick to your stomach when you hear this. But so lots of persons function like this. They just want to see the rule, the regulation, the checklist. And ethics does include that. But you can see the important thing is it goes further. Now think back on the title slide. We're going to look at bioethics principles. A principle is not a rule, it's a concept. And so we are going to look at these concepts and say, okay, so what are the ethics principles here? And then we're going to try and see how can we apply those in different contexts. Because you can think from jewelry to ICT, there's a big gap. But there's also lots of overlap, luckily. But to apply it in all these contexts equally is what we're going to try and aim to do in this workshop. But secondly, ethics is to take a pause to reason. In other words, we think through what we are busy with. We don't just follow some other rule or principle for the sake of it. And I think that's part of being an academic. Academia means that we apply our minds to whatever we're busy with. We don't just make jewelry. We think it through. We have a model, a theory that we work with. And whatever we are busy with, think of it. And the same with ethics, that when we do something, we must be able to actually substantiate what we're busy with. Why are these principles the principles? Why don't we do this? Why not that? Why do we give preference to this? Can you see? And so all of that asks for reason. So it's a bit of hard work because it asks from you to apply your mind to this. And I think that's where ethics challenge people. Often individuals want to have a checklist because that's easy. They don't want to say, there's the 10 principles, now apply it. Because then you have to go and think through how to apply those principles.
Ram, you mentioned on the first bullet that ethics is more and wider and deeper than just compliance. And the next slide, the next point is say to take a pause.
Yes.
To reason.
Yes.
That taps specifically to where the challenge might be, like you say. Majority of people that are conducting research don't think deeper.
Yeah.
The question is, do they have the ability to do that?
Yeah.
Or are they just ignorant of the fact that there's ethics?
Yeah.
The example you gave about the guy citing
plagiarism. Yeah.
Obviously what they did is plagiarism.
Yeah.
They stole somebody else's work.
Yeah.
But were they thinking deeper about the repercussions and
exactly.
consequences? So the thing is, do they have the faculties to think critically about the actions that they do?
Yeah.
That's one of the questions that we need to pose.
Of course, yes.
Perhaps the gap should be one's ability to think critically and deeper about one's actions.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And so I think we can write papers and theses on those same questions. But I think as a university, we must believe that everyone has the ability to learn ethics. But there's also this interesting question in ethics literature nowadays, where ethicists ask the question, can ethics be taught? And it sounds like silly, huh? But there's a very deep reasoning behind it. And one guy actually then wrote something very powerful for me. He wrote, ethics can't be taught, it must be experienced and learned. So, can you see, it's something that this person is wanting to say, that by just me teaching ethics doesn't mean that you're going to be ethical at the end of the day. Unless you have experienced, unless you have learned that ethical principles for yourselves. And so that is something that we must do in academia. That I believe everyone has the ability to learn ethics and to be ethical. But it also asks a personal commitment from those persons. And the second point is that we as a university, or let's say broader as academics, have a responsibility to make people aware of ethics, to put words to it. Because remember what I've said in the beginning, ethics is common sense, but common sense we must sometimes put words to. That we sometimes know what is the right thing to do, but we don't really know what the words are. And so that's what we must do in academia as well. To all of us, I mean, when you go back to your faculties, to your directorates after this, you have a responsibility to take the message to that environment, to use the right words, to help people to understand the ethical principles that they sort of intuitively know. Because every person has, or most people have, a sense of right and wrong. It doesn't matter whether they're academics or not. Because right and wrong is not just an academic concept. Think of it, something that we learn from so young. You can't eat this, eat that, you must be at home by 6 this evening, And you see, whether we're religious or not, but religion per se is also ideas and principles on what is right and wrong. And so all of us come from a certain history. So it links up to all of that. So we can say, does people have the capacity? I think we should say yes. But we also must ask, do we have a responsibility to make people aware of the principles? And the answer is also yes. And so that is where ethics education comes into play. So, yes.
I just wanted to find out what you have just said in terms of such ethics in a form that somebody must be able to experiment that such ethic.
Yes.
But my question is based on your take that why should such ethics not be taught and somebody should be able to experiment it, but business ethics is taught in other institutions.
Oh yes.
But why? I just want to know from you.
Yeah. I think it links up to this. I think we must teach ethics, but that in itself doesn't make anyone ethical. You see, I think in this interaction, in the teaching and learning interaction, we must remember to not just teach ethics, but to make sure that persons can experience ethics in that situation so that they can learn the ethics for themselves. So those three concepts, I think, go together. It's not the one or the other. Teaching, learning, experiencing goes together. I mean, think of it just in a small way. I let you experience something about ethics by just playing this little game in the beginning. You see, it's a game, it's an experience. But in that experience, you are learning something without actually teaching it. That's the amazing part, because you are in a situation to experience it. And so often, think of it in business, we are in situations where we are confronted with bribes, with fraud, with all of that, with dubious activities. So we are challenged every day and we experience some other situation. And if we have the principles, we can move into that situation. We can think it through. And you see, so all of those are actually just intertwined in each other. But I think the important part is we shouldn't just be satisfied to say there are business ethics being taught all over. We should actually look at how it's taught. We must look at, does it make a difference? Like with what we do at the university is, you know that we have to each year submit publications to the Department of Higher Education for subsidy purposes. And from this year onwards, by law, the university have to have a publication integrity committee that must report to the department before we submit those. And so the interesting thing is that when you sit in that committee and I look at all these publications submitted, guess what do I see? I see some wonderful publications, but we also see some dubious publications. And then I say, okay, but what has happened here? This is a very well-known researcher, but this publication is clearly a copy of another one submitted to another journal. So what has happened here? Even senior persons sometimes lack that, and they cannot claim they've never heard the principles. But are they really applying it in their own lives? So we also look at outcomes in a sense. So all of that goes, I think, to a large degree with business ethics. We see that a lot. How do people do business out there? That is actually the crunch of all of this. All the training they received will count for nothing if it's not applied in their practices. And so that's where we all play a role in teaching, in learning and experiencing, and making sure it doesn't just remain philosophical concepts, because that's what can easily happen. Ethics can just be, okay, it's about confidentiality, anonymity, and those are nice words to throw around. But do we actually know what it means? Why do we want this to happen? And that is where that experience and learning must come into play, not just the teaching of the words. And so that interaction, I think, is quite important. The last one is actually a nice little concept I got somewhere, which said that ethics is practical philosophy, which in a sense is very true, clearly. Because you will quickly see as we go along, ethics is embedded in a sense in philosophy. So we're going to do a bit of philosophy without boring you today. And without you perhaps even realizing we're doing philosophy. But often we think of philosophy as something airy-fairy up there, that people think and write about and nobody else cares about it. But ethics is where we take all these principles and we bring it down to the ground, where we do business, where we make jewelry, where we do develop curriculums, for instance, can you see? And there it counts. So it must be practical philosophy. Otherwise, it's just saying the right thing, but doing the wrong things. Think of what we often see, people that will say, okay, I'm against this, but tomorrow what do we hear? That very same person is doing exactly those things. And then we just feel, okay, something doesn't ring true here. I can say the right philosophy, but I'm not doing it. So there's something not right. And that is where we use words like integrity. Persons lack integrity. And how often we use those words today. And not just today, but over a long time, we often refer to this. Or on the other hand, with persons with high integrity, persons that say this and they actually do that same things. And think of how we look up to those persons. They become role models in society and in many places where we are. And so that's what we're going to look at in terms of the ethics. Okay, so what are these words? What are these philosophical terms? On this slide you will see 16 words. I think if you look at all of those, you will immediately recognize them as the words that are linked to research ethics, some or other way. You will see words like privacy, confidentiality, anonymity, risk, harm, benefit. You will see things like social responsibility, vulnerability, non-stigmatization, etc. Those 16 terms come from a quite important ethics document that is actually recognized worldwide. That is known as the UNESCO Declaration of Human Rights and Bioethics. And that declaration is, if I remember correctly, was signed in 2005, so actually quite recently. The interesting thing is 191 countries throughout the world signed that they will subscribe to these principles for bioethics and human rights. That document is recognized by more people than any other ethics document in the world. And so often we think about documents like the Helsinki Declaration and those that are sort of the most well-known ones. But those documents are actually only recognized properly by relatively small communities of researchers, while this document is recognized globally. And so it's an important document. And those 16 principles are the main principles embedded in that UNESCO declaration. And so we're going to look at it, but you will see some interesting words there. You will see things like protection of future generations that we often even don't think about as researchers, but clearly is an important ethical principle. Benefit sharing. You can ask Cynthia's office that her office is doing just that, making sure that there's agreements on benefit sharing, recognition of intellectual property rights, etc. That all links with that. So important ethical principles. And so we're going to, in today and tomorrow, look at some of these. We're going to look at about half of them. And then I will just tease you to say that the other half is done in follow-up workshops. So if you want to hear more, you will have to come for more. But we only have time for some of them. And the ones that we're going to look at are those ones. We're going to look at those 8 concepts or 7 concepts. And you will see I've dotted it down on the board just for sort of your reference. We're going to look at human rights first, which doesn't sound like much of an ethical concept, but you will see that human rights become a very important sort of framework in which we do ethics in South Africa and actually worldwide at the moment. Then we're going to look at something like human dignity. Somebody in the discussion where I was involved with this little game actually mentioned it, that we don't regard anybody else any longer. So something of human dignity. Then we're going to look at benefits and harms. Then autonomy, informed consent. Interesting here. Often when we think about ethics, what do we think about first? Informed consent. and that is a long history. But we will look at it, and it's actually even not the most important principle. There are other more important ones. But we will look at informed consent. Then we will look at vulnerability, and lastly we're going to look at integrity. And we will get to perhaps the last 2 only tomorrow. We will just see how we go today. I will leave it on, and you will see how the one flows into the other. And those are sort of the main areas that we need to look at. The ones that are sort of in the darker shade of grey are ones that we will get to in a later workshop. And you will see they are also important. I had to select the most important ones for us. But in 2 other workshops, there are just 2 one-day workshops, we can look at some of those and see how they fit into a system, and they also affect us in our environments in TUT. Okay, so let's kick off with the first one. We're going to sort of start off by looking at that first topic in human rights. To do that, we're going to do a little case study. And I will tell you the story, but you will see the case studies, or in any case, in your files, in your notes. And you can read it through later or even use it if you want to. So let's listen to this case study, and then you will have to say how you're going to handle it. Okay. In the Northern Cape High School in Kimberley, the high school was suffering from a whole lot of vandalism in the toilets, as we see in many school environments. But especially in this school, they struggled a lot with graffiti on the walls. Sometimes the basins were blocked with toilet paper and the taps were left open and the place flooded. And I think, as in many other toilets, we see bullying, with stronger, bigger children bullying smaller, more petite children. And so it became a really big problem in this high school. Then the principal of the high school decided to do something about it. And so the plan he proposed was to install closed-circuit TV cameras in the toilets, okay, to monitor what is happening. He specifically indicated that in the girls' toilets, the cameras would only pick up images in sort of the common areas and not in the toilet cubicles at all. And in the boys' toilets, it would be that as well, but then also on the back of the boys at the urinals, okay, would be visible on the footage. Okay, so that was his plan. He then submitted it to the school board, and he invited some of the parents, obviously, to participate in the discussion. Let's imagine that they were struggling with this and they couldn't get some clarity on it. And then they heard about you, that have attended this wonderful ethics course and have expertise in ethics. And they asked you to come and advise them on whether this proposal is ethical or not. And so what will you tell the school board?
I think they've got to weigh up. There are only a certain amount of students committing the crimes, but now everybody's dignity is being affected by the cameras, and I think that is the main problem.
Yeah. Okay.
But I don't know if it's...
Okay, so you want to say we must have a balance here. The harms that are being done in terms of the criminal or behavior that we see, the bullying behavior, the harm done or the damage done to the school property, etc., to dignity of the students or of the learners. Okay? How would the dignity be affected? What do you mean if you say dignity is somehow at stake here? What does that mean?
I think the cameras are in a very private location.
Yes.
And I think that whole human rights element comes in about are you with the school kids, because somebody has to look after their rights as well. Would they feel comfortable?
Yes.
And I can tell you now, I'm sure most of the school girls, I can only speak for girls, would not feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Even if it's not in the cubicles,
but
even in the bathrooms.
Yeah, so it's something about a private space, something of privacy that's at stake here. It means somehow perhaps human rights is at stake. Okay, some other ideas? Yes.
What about people's obligations? I mean, you can't just always have rights. There's vandalism there, so the kids are also obliged not to do it.
Yeah.
So, because the school every time must clean up the mess and repaint.
Yeah.
So there's not just one side to this case.
Yeah.
What about the rights of the school? So it's quite difficult to... And I think they are handling it responsibly, because it's just in certain areas.
Yeah.
If they had it in other areas, it would definitely not be
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah.
But there's also, from the kids' side, there's a responsibility
Yes.
that's lying on them.
So in a sense, if I can summarize what you're saying, is that somehow there's some obligation. Obligation on the principal to look after resources, etc. Okay, so obligation in some other way. But it also seems that by doing this, there can be some benefit. We can protect children who are bullied, for instance. So there might be good outcomes for vulnerable children. Okay, that's possible.
As much as the human rights issues at stake here, the other aspect is the values that the school stands for and how do they go about instilling that. It goes back to the parents as well.
Yeah.
For vandalism to happen, who are the guys that are vandalizing? What are their values? As much as the principal is there, it goes back again to the parents. What type of values are we instilling in the society that we're living in? What we portray in terms of vandalism and so forth. So it's multifaceted to arrive at now having to police them with that. So I think it needs to be looked at holistically to try and uproot the root cause in order for cameras ultimately not to be there, students not to vandalize. You see. So from an ethical point of view, I would advise that let's get to the root cause. And parents are there. If now the final measure is for us to put there, and we've tried other avenues now, we'll be left with no choice but to not infringe on their rights and put them in strategic positions where we can pick up who the vandalists are.
Yeah.
You know?
By listening to all of this, I think you immediately realize that it's just a simple little case study, but suddenly the answers sound like very complex here. And we can do lots of things, and there can be lots of objections. We can say there's lots of obligations involved. We can say, okay, let's go back. This is just a temporary solution, if it is, can be regarded as a solution at all. And can you see? And this case study is obviously meant to just get you thinking that whenever we are confronted by what we will call a dilemma like this, there's not just easy answers. Often we want to say, okay, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. But it's not that as easy as that. Even in research ethics, that when we look at situations, the more we think, the more we can come up with different perspectives. And sometimes when we get in heated discussions about exactly this, because I can imagine that meeting was quite heated at stages, and because this is a real case study, it really happened. Somehow we must now say, okay, let's just calm down here and look at what are the principles. How do we weigh up principles? Can you see the interesting thing here is that there are principles of privacy, but if we fully respect everyone's privacy, then somebody's going to get bullied. So are we going to uphold privacy and let somebody be at risk of being bullied? Or are we going to invade privacy and somebody's going to be protected? And so what weighs heavier? Can you see? It's not just, it sounds always easy when we look at those 16 principles, say, okay, yeah, that sounds very fine, let's do all of that. But often we are in situations where if you do the one thing, you violate another principle. And so you must look at it and see, okay, so which principle weighs heavier in this situation? How can we perhaps get win-win here? And sometimes we can't. And so those are the challenges that lie before us. Okay, I'm not going to tell you what the outcome is. You can actually go and read it up if you want to see what they actually decided. But it's obviously a complex answer to the question. Okay, so let's just see what is happening here. Okay, so that brings us to the first one, because we've now mentioned a few words and obviously referred to that first topic, human rights. Now, all of us live in a human rights society in South Africa, and we are proud of it. If I should ask you and put you on the spot now to define human rights. Not give me an example. I know a human right is the right to life, all of that. That's easy. What is a human right? What is a human right? What would you say? Without peeping in your notes now. You mustn't be naughty students. Just
people for who they are.
respecting people for who they are. Okay? Can't I respect people for who they are without human rights?
Well, it's like you said. Now it's difficult to say you have the right to this, the right to that, the right to that. But everyone has a right to life. Everyone has a right to basically believe and be who they are and what they want to be, and you cannot discriminate against a person for who they are.
Yeah. So why not? So what's the underlying principle? What brings all of those things together in what we call human rights?
Yeah, giving people the opportunity to have a dignified existence.
Yes. Yes. It's to create a context in which people can live with dignity. I like that. Yes. Other ideas?
Yeah, I think they've covered. But what I wanted to say is a human right is simply something that you deserve to have.
Yeah.
Just by being a human being.
Yes.
Those things must be there for you.
Yeah.
By the fact that you're a human being.
So it's something that applies to humans and to nothing else. We don't give the same rights to this table or to bacteria or anything like that. So there's something unique about humans, and that gives them some privileges that we don't accord to something else. Yes, I like that. One definition can be this. A right is a legitimate claim that is independent of cultural preferences. It is universal, so it applies everywhere. Okay, and it applies equally to all individuals by the virtue of being a human being. So there's no lots of words. Let's look at them. A human right is a legitimate claim. That means that if you claim something to be a human right, most other people must agree with you. Otherwise, it's not a legitimate claim. So you can't just be very selfish and claim something because you want it to be your right, but actually nobody else agrees with you, because that's not legitimate anymore. Legitimate means most people agree with you. That's actually the interesting thing, huh? Watch the news every evening, and almost without exception, there would be somebody being very vocal, claiming something to be a right, that you just say, what? That's not a human right at all. You just used the right words to impress others, but you're actually very selfish. You only want something for your little group, but nobody else should have it because you are special. Can you see that's not a human right? Because human rights is a legitimate claim, and it is independent of cultural preferences. This is actually quite important, because we don't think of it. If I say, because I like braaivleis, if I say I have a right to braaivleis, can I make such a claim? Not if you are a vegetarian. You would just say that's crazy. I don't want to eat braaivleis, so that cannot be a human right at all. So what do I have a right to? I have a right to food. You see the big difference? Saying that I like braaivleis is a cultural preference. Saying that I'm a vegetarian is a cultural preference. But all of us need food somehow, can you see? And so that's an important part. So we need to look very careful at this, and just keep that in mind always, that human right is a legitimate claim independent of cultural preferences. It is universal. So we can't just say human rights in South Africa. Human rights is a universal principle. And obviously we know there are societies that does not uphold human rights. But in our modern day society, those contests are frowned upon. Think of places like North Korea, that nobody will agree or would say, okay, I would like to live there. I hope not. Because you don't have human rights there. You can't make decisions for yourself. The state or the supreme leader decides on your behalf what is going to happen and not going to happen, can you see? Very restricted. You can't have those claims. You can't have dignity in living your life. But it's also important that human rights applies equally to everyone. Now this is a very contentious one because we don't see much of it. But in principle, human rights are the same for every person, regardless. That means that the vagrant sleeping under the bridge and the president of the country enjoys the same human rights. Nobody has more or less human rights than another person based on anything. In principle, there's nothing you can do to lose your rights. Nothing. There's also nothing that you can do to get some more. That's the nice part. So you can't gain rights and you can't lose rights. You have it. Can you see? It's something that belongs to every person. You don't have to show anything. You don't have to show a certificate or pass a test or pay some money. Nothing like that. It applies to everyone, regardless. And obviously that's going to challenge us because you will see many of the other principles rest on this. That very often, for good or bad reasons, some persons want to claim more rights than others.
Animal farm.
Yes, exactly. And it even happens in academia. Let me give you some example. Where a researcher just wants to use his or her students in a research project and say, okay guys, quickly fill in this, but doesn't realize by doing that you're actually coercing your own students to be part of your research. Because will any one of those students say, I'm going to take part of your research? Can you see? And why not? Because you are marking their next test. You are marking your exam paper. And how will they know that you just say, oh yeah, this guy gave me a hard time in class. I'm just going to be a bit stricter in marking their paper. Can you see? So I don't have a right to collect data from my students. They have a right to refuse as well. But often we don't give them that right. Can you see? And so we must be careful in just thinking of those other guys that are not upholding human rights. Because sometimes it's very subtle and we must look at it very carefully. Okay, so that's the principle. Now an interesting one is that last bullet. That we must remember a human right is not unrestricted. You can't just claim your right and what the heck for the rest. There is actually some restrictions, and the restriction is important. It is restricted to where it harms the rights of others. Let me tell you, where I stay, there are some persons that almost every night, at like 1 o'clock in the morning, come driving in, and guess what? Everyone can hear what music they're listening to. And so I'm always asking myself, okay, but come on guys, we all have to work tomorrow, just give me my little space. But what will that person claim? Oh, I have a right to play my music, which I probably have. But can you see how it infringes on my right to not be bombarded by somebody else's music when I don't want to listen to it? Can you see that? So by claiming I can play my music is just half the story, because that is selfish if I infringe on your right to privacy. And so that is sometimes what we forget, that obligations, can you see? I have an obligation to see that the same rights I'm claiming for myself are possible for every person I come in contact with. If I can't do that, then I'm not understanding the concept of human rights yet. Look at the news again every night. What do we hear? Lots of people claiming human rights, but we don't see much of obligations or much of affording those same claims to others. So they are actually missing the point here. They are using the right words to sort of manipulate, but they're not truly understanding what it means. If I claim rights, I'm no more special than anyone else. I must also give those same rights to somebody else. Otherwise, I'm not true to the principle here. And so that is the basis of human rights. Huh? So it's actually big challenges. There's lots of rights and freedoms, but also lots of responsibilities. Those two go together. It's flip side of the same coin here.
Listening to you, I'm enjoying this discussion a little bit, but listening to you, can human rights ever be attained in its entirety?
Yeah.
Because scenarios are so different.
Yes.
Situations are so different.
Yes.
People perceive the same things in very different ways.
Yeah.
Someone probably let's say there's a coup and there's violence, and that person or that leader decides to kill these people because they're killing other people.
Yeah.
You know, this is where I'm
Yeah.
trying to play around as you talk
Yeah.
about South Korea
Yeah.
and other places.
Yeah.
The guy sleeping under the bridge and the president sleeping in a mansion. And we're still talking about human rights and saying they deserve equal. So it's sounds so theoretical.
Yeah.
Very difficult to
Yeah.
attain.
I think part of the answer is that human rights is aspirational. We aspire to get it realized. And in society, I think everyone will agree that there's always some human rights that are being violated. Always something that restricts me. There's limited resources. Think of students not being able to pay their fees because of financial constraints. They have a freedom there's a right to education, but somehow they're constrained. And so those are the realities. But the human rights principles would be the aspirations. This is the society, the way that we want to function and that we want to make true. And so in all we do, we will strive to make that true with the realization that probably we will never fully attain it. When we look at contexts where there are no human rights, we see there's nothing to aspire to. You are completely blocked off. That you will rather, I think, live in a country with human rights but restricted resources than in a super rich society with all the resources but no human rights. Can you see? And so that would be part of the answer and part of our responsibility. And I think it's also part of our research, can you see? Research endeavors is to look at ways to have more efficient everything, more efficient curriculums so that more people can have higher knowledge, higher skills to earn more later in life. And so we can look at all our fields. So it will always be aspirational. And so I think we don't have to be despondent to say, okay, we will never reach that, and so we just do nothing. We will rather say, yes, there it is, but let's reach for it. Let's make sure that as far as we can, we contribute to these principles. I think that is what we strive for. Think of it just in the logo of the university, we empower. Can you see? There's an aspiration, but we know we will never be able to empower everyone. But the university strives at least to do that. Part of that system. Okay. The function of human rights is then also interesting. And we have sort of touched on it. Because human rights create a context that enables people to choose the course of their lives. It sounds easy, but it's actually profound in a sense. Human rights give a context in which individuals can decide who they want to be, ultimately. Can decide what clothes they wear, what religion they belong to, what political party they belong to or not, what job they do, who they marry or not. Can you see? And so that context is actually quite important. So that's the framework. Think of it. Human rights creates a context in which we want to make this possible for people. And can you see, that's where poverty and all of those are actually constraints, because it makes it sort of limits my possibilities. Inadequate schooling limits my possibilities of doing the career I want to pursue. But that's sort of the framework, and sort of in a broader life sense, what human rights strive towards. And so you can see the flip side of this is that it gives a context, but it brings self-responsibility. Because what do we see here? Human rights say, okay, I can pretty much decide what I want to do, where I want to do, how long I want to wear my hair, or no hair at all. Can you see? It doesn't matter. But it also makes me responsible for my choices. And so sometimes we want to do all kinds of things but don't accept responsibility for it. If I drive 100 in the city center, I can do that. That's my choice. But if I get caught, I must pay up. That's the responsibility, can you see? I must take responsibility for driving above the speed limit. And not just say, oh, I'm exercising my rights. Yeah, true. But you're infringing somebody else's rights by putting their lives in danger. And we must take responsibility. And so those things go together. You will see later on that this concept becomes really important for research participants that partake in our research, because they are still responsible for saying yes or no, whether they participate or not in our research, and they must make good choices for themselves. But it's based on this. So self-responsibility. The second bullet also indicates something really interesting, that individual rights trump social utility. Okay, so that sounds a bit, okay, what the heck. Individual rights trump social utility. It means this, that no person's individual rights can be trampled on for the greater good. It's ultimately what it says. Let me give you a bit of an extreme example. Let's say with riots somewhere. I can't go in and shoot a few of the leaders so that everyone will calm down. I mean, I can say, okay, but if I just beat a few of these guys up, everyone's going to calm down because they're going to realize I'm going to beat them up too. Can you see that is where I infringe on those individuals' right not to be beaten up by me, because I think the whole group is going to calm down. Where individual rights trump social utility. So we can never do something and claim the greater good is served by whatever way I am infringing on your rights. Now I know that it sounds like, okay, but we can think of many exceptions to the rule here, and we can, because there is obviously a principle as well that we must look at society. But we will always weigh this up very, very carefully. In strict human rights society, the individual's rights weigh heavier than that of society. And it's important in research too. I can't just say to participants, come on guys, you must all participate because then society is going to know more about X, Y, and Z. That's not a good reason. I must look at the rights of those individuals. And voluntary participation, anonymity, all of those are important. I can't say, okay, the bigger society is going to benefit from this. So we will always work with that. And sort of conflict. Because there's sometimes a conflict where we want to say, but okay, society is going to benefit from this. Come on guys, just work together with me. But human rights will look at the individuals first, and then at society, the social utility in this case. We will look at some examples. The last one in this regard, let's just see what we have for time. Okay, the word autonomy, you will see that autonomy is going to come a bit later on. The word that we use for this self-responsibility is autonomy. Autonomy means every person is responsible for him or herself, to make decisions, to live with that decisions, can you see? And that's what we refer to as autonomy. So self-determination. And it stands against something very interesting. The opposite is paternalism. And I think you all know what paternalism is. Pater, Latin word for father. That somebody that is caring for his children. But paternalism obviously is where somebody say, I am somehow the father figure and you guys down below, I know what's best for you. So I will decide. Can you see? How often do we see this in research? Where the researcher becomes paternalistic. Actually thinking he or she knows what's best for everyone. And so everyone must just fall into place with their research. You see. So we must be careful in doing this, especially in social research. We see this, that there's a big drive where the researcher is not even in control of the research, which is interesting, huh? Think of action research, where the participants are actually in control of the research, which can you see is completely opposite from a few years back, where we saw lots of paternalistic research and interactions. And think of it, just in our society, we are moving away from it. Think of our university. If the VC says something, we don't just accept it blindly. We often challenge him on whatever he said. Think of a classical example with this biographical information. You remember a few weeks ago we all got this message to say, you better fill this in, otherwise we're going to withhold your salary. Doesn't that sound like paternalism? No. Guess what happened? A few people stood up and said, that's not going to happen. And so have you checked the last few messages? That threat is not there anymore. Because somehow somebody decided this was a good threat. And they were challenged and they realized, perhaps not such a good idea. Let's just work on an equal basis. And so what do they try to do now? They try to persuade all of us as equals, which is nice. Because that's how it should have been from the start, actually. But can you see how easily we move between these extremes? Okay, so let me just see. Okay, so let's watch a little video clip. It's about 10 minutes long, and this one is obviously on human rights, and it's going to be a 10-minute, very fast history lesson. No, not history lesson, a very fast of what happened in terms of human rights from way back till right now. When it's at the end, I'm going to ask you how what we've said up to now about human rights and what you've seen in this little video clip, what sort of stands out for you at this stage? Because remember what we're busy with. We're busy with research ethics. So we're not busy with human rights per se, in terms of just the philosophy around it, but how it can apply to research ethics. Okay, so let's watch it.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Well, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human, any...
The rights that humans have?
That's a very large debate.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, una domanda complicatissima.
We just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. he announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded. But the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, He was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers, free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent, who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Okay, so what stood out for you?
The struggle. The long struggle. And how long it took the human race to realize, hey.
Yeah. It sort of links with your previous question on, okay, so what? It sounds so perfect, so we never get it. And that's true, huh? It's not like 10 or 20 years, decades or centuries. It's ongoing. But I think we should say we are probably living in a much better society than a century ago, overall. Doesn't mean perfect, but in general, further down the line at least. Yes?
So to me, it seems like it says human rights are not, they depend on the time and age.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in each age, it seems like somebody has to define. Because when we spoke earlier about they must be legitimate, I was asking myself, who defines the legitimacy?
Yeah.
Because somebody must define that. Now we have the UN having defined it in a particular way. Maybe another organization will come later and say, but they are not right. Actually, the definition was not correct.
Yeah. Exactly, I agree with you. I mean, it's always developing. I think that's the whole point. Huh? That the ideas around human rights are not final, and I think in 100 years from now we will look back and say, okay, we were pretty primitive in our ideas perhaps 100 years back. We would have progressed in ways or in ideas that we don't think of at the moment. And so that's always part of it. So it's always developing. And I think on the legitimacy, I like the last part. There's not one, it's not a UN that decides what's right or not. It's all of us. Every person must contribute and stand up, and that's what changes the views, what challenges ideas. And that's how it should be. I think at the moment that some of these rights in the United Nations are very much challenged, and it's probably going to change very quickly, which is good. It needs to be dynamic.
Sure. I just want to, when we say everyone contributes, sometimes I always say, what do we mean by everyone? Because I've heard a lot when people say, it's the people that are more powerful that you claim everyone has contributed.
Oh yes.
It's not the everyone. The actual everyone is very difficult to contribute. The powerful that then claim that we represent everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're so right. You're so right. I think the clip actually shows it out, that there's always some champion that stands up and that is thinking much further than everyone at that moment. And that person influences where the ideas go. And so it's very true. It's very true.
Linking to what he's saying, what stood out for me after the history background where he started and so forth, and the question was, what now? And who should do what?
Yeah.
And he touched on the aspect of the choices that we make each and every day.
Yeah.
And for me, thinking deeper, it would be what informs the choices that I make.
Yeah.
What says to me left or right? What
Yeah.
says to me good or bad?
Yeah.
And in spite the list that can still be
Yeah.
critically
Yeah.
challenged to say,
Yeah.
is it real or not?
Yeah.
So we spoke about the context, the current context
Yeah.
now. A guy sleeping under the bridge and a
Yeah.
guy sleeping in a mansion.
Yeah.
Same principles, they have same
Yeah.
rights.
Yeah.
What do we do now?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
much more deeper than just
Yeah.
having feel.
Oh yes.
It's
Yeah.
ongoing.
Yeah. I think 2 comments on that. Remember what we said right in the beginning. Ethics is opposed to reason. That we keep on discussing. We can never arrive and say, this is the ultimate list. Because that would be an arrogant position. So we should challenge even any of those positions. It's always open for reasoning. Think of in society how we think about democracy even. Even that concept sounds so fundamental to human rights, but even that is often challenged. Or questions are asked about it, and we can look at everyday stuff. So that pause to reason is very important. I think the second point is that at a university like ours, we are in a very good position because we are working in an environment where we are supposed to think every day. And if we don't, that's actually would be a little bit of a accusation against academics. We should be some of these persons that are role models of thinking and challenging. And I think that's why I always liked students challenging us as well. I don't always agree with their methodology because I think that infringes on some other human rights. But they are young and inexperienced sometimes. But we are role models that should play a role in this.
For me, as a curriculum developer, it spoke directly to the ideology behind curriculum development and who decide in the political, because you can never divorce education and politics of the day and the current context. So for us to be able to design a curriculum that would be talking to those type of graduate attributes where we'll be empowering our students to be able to see and make certain decisions based on the human rights UN list. It's how we design that. And the lecturers that we currently have and the history and the context of that we have. We're mentioning here at UT currently recalculating. And we need to embed within our curriculum such graduate attributes so that upon graduating our students are able to claim and even understand and know what does it mean for human rights across all race, grade, religious background and so forth. It's upon us to do that.
I'm of the opinion that things like ethics education should be a part of every curriculum. There should be parts where it's addressed, not just implicitly but explicitly, because that is, I think, part of our responsibility in all of this. Yes, please.
From my opinion, I think human being firstly is legitimate and is equally for everyone. But for the human being must, from my opinion, must limited by the moral outlook and also limited by the culture and the history. So different culture and maybe they have the different thought. So.
Of course. I think history, moral development, all of those play very, very definite roles. And if we ignore those, we would be, that would be really bad, because then we'd be very ignorant. So we must take that in consideration. No person is exactly the same place. everyone is in a different place because of history, because of viewpoints, all of that, because of personal values, personal choices, and we're all on the move as well. So Mackenzie, it goes back to that, the individual rights trump social utility also. That we shouldn't just look at students as a homogeneous group. We will do that at our own peril. I think it's a challenge for us as educators to recognize our colleagues as individuals, but also our students as individuals. Because it would be, we will be able to guide them the best by recognizing all of that. It's not easy, it makes life very difficult for all of us, but it will greatly contribute to each of those persons' development, to not just see them as a group, or to refer to them as a group. We must often think of our own language that we use in class. Are we just treating them as a group, or are we actually recognizing individuals as part of a group? The group is there, but the group is not more important than the individual in this case. Yes.
To come back to what Tindani said about powerful people, I think they sort of realized these last number of years that social media is just bringing it to the people.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
The voice of the people are coming much more.
Yeah. Oh yes. And I think it just causes, let's say, powerful individuals, it doesn't matter in what position they are, to be more responsible. It actually makes them more accountable because they are held more accountable, which is a great thing. It should be like that. Yes.